Let's start on time, and then we'll end on time. First question is, can one have too much of the Ottomans? Well, I believe not. They were too significant a part of world history and our own cultural identity to be sidelined. Last year, the LLF was privileged to hear Mark Bauer talk about the Ottomans as Khans, Caesars, and Khalifas. Yesterday afternoon, Diana Darke, our guest speaker today, talked about her award-winning book, Stealing from the Saracens. I hope some of you were able to attend from it and benefit from it. She's with us to discuss her latest book, The Ottomans, A Cultural Legacy. You see the cover of it here. It was published last year. Diana describes herself as a cultural expert with degrees in Arabic and Islamic art and culture, and she's also, in parallel, a prolific broadcaster on the BBC and Al Jazeera. Unlike Mark Bauer's book, which was a linear chronological history of the Ottomans, Diana in her book takes a radial view of the social elements in the lives of the Ottomans. It includes 12 chapters focusing on, for example, the Ottoman psyche, its statecraft and diplomacy, geography, and religious values, and then moves on to a review of its commercial spirit, architectural identity, aesthetic sensitivities, and musical traditions. It also talks about the Ottomans' culinary delights. And the Ottomans, not surprisingly, like us Lahoris, were gluttons. And so she has a chapter on the after effects of gluttony, and it's called Medical Mores. Among post-medieval history, the Ottomans ruled continuously over 600 years, and 300 years of that were dominated by one dynasty. They were in power for longer than the Romans and controlled an area, as Diana will share with you in maps, larger than the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans used their powerful navy, unlike the Mughals, who never went beyond the subcontinent. They used their powerful navy to take Egypt, North Africa, Syria, and Arabia, until they controlled the three holiest cities in Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. By the 17th century, the Ottomans controlled 1/4 of Europe. Diana mentions in her introduction that putting together the pieces of the Ottoman legacy proved a challenging and complex puzzle. Like many in the West, I did not realize, she said, how Europeanized the Ottomans were. So Diana, would you like to present the jigsaw puzzle that you've been able to reassemble? Thank you very much indeed. Please.
Thank you very much. And the reason for the book and its existence at all is because of the 100-year anniversary since the Ottoman Empire's demise. So certainly in Europe, we have a very negative image of the Ottomans, and all the focus traditionally has been on the bloody, final, chaotic decades. Whereas what I wanted to do in this book is to show that the Ottomans did not begin like this. This is not the representative picture that we, in Europe at any rate, have of the Ottomans. Any empire that lasted 600 years and spanned 3 continents and encompassed 72 different nationalities and ethnic groupings, as they were then, and over 12 different languages, to succeed for that long, you have to get something right. And so what I wanted to show in this book is the things that they did get right, and they got a lot right. And in many ways, there are certain things we can learn from them. So this was my starting point. What can we learn from the Ottomans? And when I say we, I don't just mean we Europeans, I mean everybody, because there are elements to do with multiculturalism and refugee codes that we can all learn, I think, from the Ottomans. So the book, as I mentioned, a lot of books focus on the final bloody decades, whereas I choose to focus on the beginnings of the Ottomans, because this is very little known on the whole in my experience. So just to show how they began, at the beginning of the round about 1300, 1299, Osman, the founder, moved westwards. The Ottoman movement was always east to west, And the reason they moved west was because they were escaping the Mongol hordes who were trying to steal their pasture land, and they were constantly on the move to get away from the Mongols here who were pressing on them. So they kept moving further and further until finally they were granted land by the dying Seljuk Empire, which was on its last legs. At this time, the Byzantine Empire was also on its last legs, and Osman had, if you like, the luck of timing that he was granted land here in a very fertile part of Turkey, what is today Turkey, and from there was able to build up his state. And the motto of the Ottoman state was the eternal state. Osman had a vision always to provide a state that was unlike anything that had come before. He saw the examples of all the corruption that existed, the feudal systems, and he wanted something totally different. And so it took the vision of one man with this philosophy to totally transform this region. And of course, one man has to be fairly remarkable, one family, to dominate for 600 years. And that remarkable man, Osman, is in this picture here. And it's important to realize that he was very supported by powerful women from the start, his mother and his wife. And women played a very strong role in the Ottoman Empire, which I'll be highlighting as I go through and explain how they began to create their eternal state. So they understood as nomads that they did not have the skills to set up a state. They needed to become inclusive, to bring in everybody who could help them to expand, knowledgeable traders, merchants, and people who were educated and literate. So from the start, they realized that trade was going to be the glue of their empire. So they did everything they could to facilitate trade. They created all across their empire a gigantic single market with no boundaries at all. Everything was about facilitating trade so that everybody could prosper. And the system of khans or caravanserais that they developed then all the way across their empire is illustrated in some of these early miniatures. And so merchants could stay for free in these places. And the first Ottoman capital then was Bursa. Bursa, where Osman was granted this land. So Bursa was the first major city that he was able to take from the Byzantines, and this became the Ottoman model city. And it is recognized by UNESCO as an absolute paragon of urban design, because Osman's vision was to create a city that was built from the bottom up, the complete opposite, in other words, of somewhere like Dubai, from the top down. So the important thing that he understood was to look after the community right from the bottom up. If you included everybody and provided services in a kind of community hub to everybody, then the result was that everybody benefited, and the empire was able to grow and prosper and thrive. And so in Bursa here, you can still see it today. You see the mosque in the center, you see the bazaars all around the mosque, you see the hospital, the madrasas, the baths. Everything was provided there, a soup kitchen for the poor. Everything was provided completely free for everybody. So, and it didn't matter whether you were Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or anything like that. All these services were provided free to everybody, irrespective of their background or their religion. The Ottomans were never interested in minorities in that sense. They welcomed all minorities. As long as you became a loyal tax-paying citizen, then you were welcome, and you became an Ottoman first and foremost. So in Bursa, it built its wealth on textiles, the silk khan. This is still there, the silk khan, and this became the basis of a great deal of wealth. And the textiles there Again, the women were very involved in this. In fact, all the Ottoman archives show that something like 2/3 of the equipment, the weaving equipment, was actually owned by women, quite apart from the fact that they were actually doing a lot of the weaving as well. So they were always actively involved right from the start, and even right at the very beginning, when they were as nomads moving westwards, the women fought alongside the men on horseback with babies strapped to their backs. And of course the textiles became very famous and very desirable across Europe. These textiles were not just very rich silks worn by the Sultan. They were worn by Christian bishops and patriarchs, and European royalty also became very fashionable to wear Turkish silks. And then, of course, the Ottoman carpets became very desirable objects as well. And again, it's the women who are involved in making these. Even back as nomads, the women would make these carpets and sell them in the local souks and markets in order to get much needed cash to help with the economics of when they were being pushed out and needed pasture, to buy extra feed for their flocks. It was the women were part of society, very much actively involved. And here in the middle, we've got this famous Holbein painting of King Henry VIII standing on a Holbein carpet, an Ottoman carpet. This starts to become very, very fashionable. All across Europe, these Ottoman carpets are seen as so precious that they're not put on the floor on the whole, unless you're a king. They either get put on the table or they get hung on the wall. So now the Ottomans started to expand across into the European mainland and up all the way through Greece and the Balkans, up all around the Black Sea, into areas which, of course, today are very much in the news. Ukraine, Crimea, all of this was Ottoman for several centuries, until Russia, the Russian Empire, expanded and took them, and that's when all the problems began, which are being repeated today. So the expansion shows very, very clearly here, and they also expanded down into the Arab world and across into North Africa. So the second capital that they made was Edirne, and that is on the European mainland. And people forget that the Ottoman capital from which they captured Constantinople was actually on the European mainland. They didn't come as invading hordes across from the Central Asian steppes. They conquered Constantinople from the European mainland. And not only that, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Christians fought on the Ottoman side, in later battles as well, even as late as the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, along with hundreds of Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, Transylvanian Protestants, all of whom had had enough of the Catholic fervour of the Habsburgs and the feudal tax system, and realized that they were better off being Ottomans. So, the Disney version of history, if you like, where the noble Christian is fighting the despotic Eastern Ottoman, is very much a sort of Disney view of history, that things are far, far more complex than that. And there's a famous saying that the Greek patriarch in Constantinople said, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's mitre." They did not want to be under the Pope. The relationship between the Catholics and the Orthodox was very, very strained. So in Edirne, so the picture I was just showing was the palace, very unusual building, again, very sort of typically Ottoman, unlike anything else. It's sort of like a tent up on a perch. So again, this sort of nomad heritage is coming out in the architecture, that it's like a sort of lookout tower from where they could see in all directions, a panoramic view, and it's even called a kind of panorama in Turkish. And then the palace and the audience hall is below, with an incredibly elaborate water system and a water feature that runs all the way down. Remarkably unusual way of building, which I personally believe is very much rooted in their nomadic origins. So still in Edirne, this is the synagogue that still exists in Edirne, just to show examples of how the legacy of the Ottomans lives on, because of course they welcomed refugees from everywhere. And when in Spain, the Reconquista, the Catholics, Ferdinand and Isabella, kicked out all their Jews, the Sultan welcomed them, even sent ships to go and get them, because he said, how stupid is Ferdinand to get rid of all his productive citizens? We will welcome them. We will make sure that they come here and become good, loyal, tax-paying citizens, which indeed they did, and we're very grateful to the Ottoman Sultan for that. So these show, again, the relationship that the Ottomans had with the Christian patriarch and with the Jewish rabbis. Everybody mixed with everybody else. It was the most cosmopolitan state on earth, and it was quite normal to be trilingual in a way that now you go across the Balkans, nobody can speak anything except their own language. It's just a different world now. All this to some extent has been lost, this sense of being part of something bigger, where you're not just narrowly looking at your own national identity, you're thinking much broader than that. And then we get to Mehmet the Conqueror, who takes Constantinople and then makes it the capital for the rest of the duration of the Ottoman Empire. And here he is in this famous portrait by Bellini, sniffing a rose. And again, this sort of epitomizes, to my mind, this incredible mixture that the Ottomans have between steely strength that comes from their nomadic background, or a sort of incredible determination and resolve, and yet in there is this deep appreciation of nature, which also comes from their nomadic roots. The realization that you have to live alongside nature, you have to nurture it. So this sort of conservation mentality was always deeply there and showed itself in their architecture and in their designs with all their gardens. Now, this satellite image of the Bosphorus is just to show how significant this location is of Constantinople. Of course, you've got the Black Sea to the north, you've got the Mediterranean to the south, and then from the European perspective, we see what's on the left as European and we see what's on the right as Asian. But the Ottomans never saw it like that. They never thought of themselves like that at all. And they did not see themselves as Turks either. They saw themselves as Ottomans. The word Turk at that point meant a kind of country bumpkin. So they dissociated themselves from Turk as such. And the European perspective was that this barrier of the Bosphorus, if you like, was a kind of protection to protect Europe from the chaos of that was coming out from the Middle East with regular wars and everything of that sort and refugees, whereas the Ottomans never saw themselves like that. They never saw themselves as a kind of sponge to absorb the chaos. These kind of boundaries, our European way of thinking was quite alien to them. And what they built there in Constantinople, the Topkapi Palace, was again unlike anything that had been seen on the European mainland. Most rulers' palaces were big, ornate, many stories, whereas the Topkapi Palace is very low rise, and the way it's constructed in a series of courtyards is again based on a sort of nomadic encampment. So you enter through, there are 3 sets of courtyards, and where the Sultan himself was in the final courtyard mirrors the way that a nomadic encampment was. To protect him, you had to go through several sort of antechambers almost to reach him and the seat of power there. And this miniature of the Topkapi and the gardens around it shows the Ottoman way of looking from the bird's eye view. Any kind of map or illustration of a city is always done from the bird's eye view in this very, very interesting way, but that shows how the gardens surrounded everywhere, and Mehmet himself worked in these gardens. He, for relaxation, he was often to be found actually helping with the gardeners and enjoying being close to nature as his original heritage had always been. But in the Topkapi, the other thing that became very important was the kitchens. So 60 chefs were employed in the kitchens here. They were recruited from all over the empire. They were put through rigorous tests, and only the best were selected. And one of the things, apart from all the culinary delights, all the dips and various types of, something like 47 different types of bread apparently were current in the Ottoman Empire. But of course coffee, the thing that we all now take for granted, it was the Ottomans who brought this in to the European mainland. And that happened actually at the Second Siege of Vienna, when the Turks, the Ottomans, had to abandon all their provisions and withdraw. Amongst the things that they left behind were sacks of coffee beans, and nobody had any idea what to do with them, except for one soldier who had been a prisoner of the Ottomans for a couple of years, and he recognized them as coffee beans and understood what to do with them, and he set up a sort of monopoly on coffee in Vienna, from which it then expanded obviously into Europe and into all across. So by the mid-1500s there were penny universities, as they were called, across in London, and of course now we take all of this. Coffee has become so much part of our culture that we've forgotten the origins of how it found its way from Mocha in Yemen originally, how it was traded across through Syria, and because the Ottomans adopted it with such gusto and created very elaborate, beautiful ceramics, coffee cups, to turn the whole thing into a kind of ceremony where the Sultan had his own chief coffee maker and a whole series of people who had jobs around him to provide all the the necessary ceremony that went with it. And musical instruments as well. At the Second Siege of Vienna, all the instruments were suddenly abandoned as well. So Europeans suddenly found all these instruments that they were unfamiliar with, and gradually these became then part of European culture as they learnt from these. Water systems. When Mehmet took Constantinople, he very much understood. As I mentioned, Byzantium was on its last legs. It was a dying city, very neglected. And so he understood that the first thing to make the population thrive was to bring water systems in from the Belgrade forest to the north. And so a series of aqueducts were brought in, and the whole city was covered in fountains, public drinking fountains everywhere. The one on the right here is Sinan's own, the court architect, his own fountain on his own tomb, and the Suleymaniye that Sinan built himself for Sultan Suleiman. Again, the first thing he had to do was get the water system right, to bring all the water in, and then develop this very ingenious system of filtering off the soot from the candles, filtering it up through water to produce calligraphic ink that was resistant to insects, and then the clean air was released into the city. I mean, just phenomenal recycling genius. Just a few, yeah. And then the Mostar, this is in Bosnia, because again, it's important to understand that the Ottomans felt they needed a spiritual guide alongside them always, so they had a very close relationship with the Sufi dervishes always, and encouraged the establishment of tekkes all across the empire. So this one is in Bosnia, which I visited recently. Animal welfare. They were very, very minded to look after animals. They created these astonishingly elaborate bird palaces to look after birds, and set up animal hospitals centuries before such things existed in Europe. Vaccination. The first vaccinations were performed against smallpox back in 1717, well before it was introduced in Europe, and it was administered by women in Turkish baths, given to children there, as this stamp on the left commemorates. And quarantine centres, they had to deal with many plagues and pandemics across their across their period of reign, the Black Death and many other things, and they set up quarantine centres so that all ships coming into the Bosphorus had to call off and wait to make sure they weren't carrying any disease. And this particular quarantine centre is in Hebron, in the occupied West Bank. And then finally, this is the lifestyle. The type of homes that they chose to live in, again, reflect this nomadic approach, if you like. These traditional towns, Ottoman towns. This one is, both of these are in Albania, Berat and Gjirokastër, and they are arranged on hillsides so that you have clean air circulating, so that you get good drainage, always thinking about health and the environment. And then the interiors are multifunctional, just like the inside of a tent. So you can put bedding away in cupboards, and you can, all of these rooms have many functions, so that they're continuing this nomadic tradition that they had. And so they were their legacy is so deeply embedded in most of our cultures that it's easy to forget. So I wanted to do justice 100 years on from their end to what they left us. Thank you.
Diana, thank you very much indeed for an exhaustive and a very fascinating, as I said, a radial view of the Ottoman legacy that we all have benefited from. You mentioned about Turkey and the fact that the Ottomans prefer to be known as Ottomans, not Turks. And I'm glad we don't have Erdogan in the audience, what with his revivalist Turkey thing. He wouldn't have liked to have been called a country bumpkin. You quote Catherine Caroline Finkel's observation that the pervasive notion of permanent and irreconcilable division between the Muslims and the Christian worlds was a fiction. And I think that your book reinforces this view that it was almost a mellifluous flow. The Ottoman Empire just continued without opposition, in a sense, and it was able to integrate each one of the communities, each one of the religions into its count. And unlike the Romans, where you had to be a Roman to be declared a Roman, not everybody in the Roman Empire was a Roman, the Ottomans treated everybody as an Ottoman, as an equal, and therefore they were privileged, they were entitled to the protection of the Sultan.
And not only that, but all the separate religions were given their own identity. They were allowed to run their own schools, have their own curriculums, have their own courts, for their domestic and family affairs, for example. The Ottomans weren't interested in interfering with that. That was up to each individual millet, as they called it, a separate religious grouping. And so there weren't differentiations between different types of Muslim either. There was just Muslims, all the different sections did not exist. You were a Muslim, end of story.
Lesson for all of us, and particularly today. You also mentioned about the Jews, and I'd just like to amplify something that comes from your book. They were expelled by the English in 1291, by the French in 1343, by the Germans in 1400, and Spain in 1492. And while these European, ostensibly open-minded Renaissance, and in this case pre-Renaissance, communities were expelling Jews, the Ottomans were welcoming them, and as part of a contribution to their success. A question that came to my mind, you've mentioned in your map that the Ottomans had taken over and reached as far as Saudi Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, and then moved on to Egypt, etc. They also built what was known as the Hejaz Railway, and so most of you must have seen Lawrence of Arabia, where the glorified part is where Lawrence is standing on a Turkish train and having destroyed it, etc. But the fact is that this Hejaz Railway went from Saudi Arabia all the way up north. An interesting insight, or perhaps you might like to comment on it, was in all this time, despite the fact that they had a railway, no Ottoman ruler ever performed Hajj.
The Hajj, no.
Yeah, is that true?
Absolutely true. No, none of them did. They clearly didn't see the need.
Okay. Well, I suppose if you're the Khalifa, you really don't need to. Hajj comes, it comes to you. You've touched upon...
Having said that, they were very interested in the commercial aspects of the Hajj and the facilitating of the pilgrim route by building the Hijaz Railway, of course, that, you know, the Hajj was a great river of commerce, essentially. All the pilgrims going, they need to be provided for, they need to stay somewhere. Massive opportunity for trade, so they were keen to facilitate all of that.
Marvelous. Can I just quickly turn to science? And you've mentioned in your book that Islamic science effectively ended in 1528 with the Mongol invasion, and you touched upon that, where they were more or less escaping from this inexorable invasion that was coming from the east. And you've singled out two people, if you'd like to just briefly talk about them. One is Taqi al-Din, who was an astronomer and who was remarkably accurate in his calculations of the sun. And the second is a map of the world, which we won't be able to show you here, but by an earliest cartographer, Ali Machar Rais. So could you touch upon Taqi al-Din, because he really is one of the
Yes,
stars.
he's a very little-known Ottoman astronomer. I mean, there was the observatory that was set up in Istanbul, and it was ahead of it was the world leader in its time, you know. I mean, it was most definitely ahead of what was happening in Europe at that time, and there are some wonderful Turkish miniatures of him working in his observatory, surrounded by people, and they've got all their equipment, all their you know, astrolabes, all of this, you know, which required colossal understanding of mathematics and geometry to produce all these tools in the first place, and of course navigation, which leads us into the Piri Reis and his map, his early map of the world, which is quite unique in that it shows America using a map apparently that Christopher Columbus had supposedly had made, but was never found. So it's the very, very first map to show the entire world, every continent in it. And again, you know, very little known how advanced Ottoman navigation was. The Ottoman fleet was very, very impressive.
And there's a reproduction of the map in your book. So please, I do recommend that you do have a look at it, because this really is one of the seminal contributions that was made by Muslim scholars and Muslim cartographers in this case.
Yes.
What they used to do in those days, and I think Diana will agree, is that these maps would be made available to captains, seagoing captains, who would then be expected to update them and then return them to the Royal Treasury, Royal Library, where they would then be updated, and then the next map would include the observations that were made by previous. Can we move quickly now to architecture? And you'd shown us some wonderful examples of monuments which have still been preserved, and I think that is the major contribution that the modern Turks have made to their legacy. You've talked about the bridge over the Bosphorus, and I didn't know this, but I was fascinated to discover that Leonardo da Vinci had done a drawing of it. And Michelangelo had built a model of the proposed bridge over the Bosphorus. What happened to them?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, there are a number of Renaissance figures who were invited to work for the Ottomans in the Ottoman court, and a few of them did, actually. I mean, one of them is Donizetti, I think, went and was in charge of the orchestra in Istanbul, in charge of teaching music. I mean, the Ottomans, as I said, they always very inclusive. They welcomed skills from everywhere, so they were always inviting people with great knowledge to come and join them and help them develop. This was their mindset. They were very open to new horizons. They were always looking forward. As I mentioned, you know, they wanted their state to be there for eternity.
And if I could now, because time is against us, and that's the social life. You mentioned trilingualism, which was basic to them. It wasn't a question of belonging to one particular vernacular. You had to be trained in all of them. And I'm reminded more or less of Renaissance Europe, where French and Latin and Greek were essential learning for any student. You've also mentioned about the place of women and then the mother of Usman and the wife, who play a critical role in his success. Smallpox, the inoculation, very few people know it, and the Turks were right to make it a part of their, the philately. Carpets, you mentioned about the Turkish knot, for example, and the fact that girls were required at a very early age. Would you like to elaborate on that, to learn weaving? Why?
Well, it was an acknowledged skill that women could perform, in the home without, it gave them an economic independence, and of course their fingers were small and dexterous, so they were able to do knots very, very well. And the Turkish knot was much stronger than the Persian knot. The Persian knot is a major difference between the two types of carpet. So again, going back to this nomadic heritage, the Turkish knot is very tough and strong. And this is what I see consistently in the Ottoman aesthetic, this toughness that underlies everything, and yet this deep appreciation of nature overlaid, and which shows itself in the patterns and the colours that they use.
Can we quickly now turn, because we're all Lahoris, to food? And you mentioned the 46 varieties of bread, and that something I didn't know, but which I learned from your book. Baklava was only for the rich. Is that true?
So I researched. Yes, this is what.
Well, it's rather like a bit like us, where Halim is only available, to the rich in Pakistan, but actually it's in reverse; it's available to the poor. And the fact that recipes were not written; they were passed down from father to son.
Yes, that's right. They were supposedly kept secret. Now, whether that was deliberate or just because they were constantly evolving, again, we don't know for sure.
Okay. And two, I'm sure those of you who visited Turkey, there's ayran and salep. These are the two drinks that they had, and which were made. They figure prominently in Orhan Pamuk's book on Istanbul. So what do they taste like?
Well, sahlab in particular is wonderful. It's like a liquid food. It's based on orchid root. I first drank it in Aleppo in the dead of winter, and it's the most warming thing. It makes sure you never catch a cold.
Right.
It's very thick, pistachio nuts sprinkled on top, sweet and warm and very nutritious, wonderful. And then ayran is almost the opposite, because that's the summer. In the heat of the summer, you drink ayran, which is always very cold and refreshing, and so the two are like opposites, if you're winter and summer.
Lovely. It's like our lassi and green tea, one made from yogurt and one is just a brew. And this leads me to an anecdote, with your permission. You mentioned about their lack of knowledge about the uses of coffee beans. And there was a story which, when we were at school, we were told that the English was so backward that when tea was brought from the Americas to England, they boiled it, and then they threw away the water and chewed the leaves instead. So this is folklore more than anything else. May I ask you, in the few minutes that we have left, could you please? I know, don't worry. I'm older than you are. I do know what time is. Come along. Look, can you, in your book, you've mentioned about the Tughra. Now, all of us are familiar with the Tughra of Suleiman the Magnificent, but not many of you will know something that Diana has analyzed. And may I ask you to analyze this particular Tughra, beyond the calligraphy?
Yes. Well, this is the thing. Nothing is random, ever, in architecture or art, in my experience. And these Tughras, the sort of stamp, the symbol of each sultan had their own Tughra developed for them. And of course, the most magnificent was the one of Suleiman the Magnificent himself. And the way it's designed the thinking is that, so the two loops to the left reflect the two seas that the Sultan controlled. The smaller one, the Black Sea; the bigger one, the Mediterranean. The line going off to the right is the sword, and the vertical is a symbol of sort of the flagstaff or independence. And then this movement in the wind is meant to symbolize the movement east to west, always that direction. The reason it's important is not just what it all symbolized, but it made it incredibly difficult to forge. And so this became colossally important, that you never wanted anything that the Sultan put his stamp on to be able to be subject to forgery.
Wonderful. It just shows you that you can, what is a commonplace image now associated with the Ottomans, has a much deeper meaning. And this is true throughout calligraphy, it's throughout Indian painting. It's more than just what you see. You have to go into the iconography, the vocabulary that underlines and underpins that particular image. Now, we've got 10 minutes, so may I invite the audience to ask questions of Diana? Please, please, yes, certainly. But a question, no comments, okay, if you don't mind.
It was a pleasure listening to you. I've got 2 questions to ask.
No, one question.
One question. Brief.
No, are you single or married?
Single.
Single, one question, that's it. Okay, come along.
Okay, my question is that in Europe, after French Revolution, the ideology of nationalism, took place there. And you mentioned that Ottoman Empire was, strong due to its disciplined bureaucracy and standing army. So, how do you perceive the, excedency of British naval fleet and the technological advancement that happened during the, following years, and how it led to the decline of Ottoman Empire?
The ascendancy of the British, yeah.
Well, the decline, in my view, the decline of the Ottoman Empire really began with meddling from the Russian Empire, so that started to weaken it from the eastern side. So Catherine the Great starts to come in and to steal parts of the Crimea, the Podalia, which is modern Ukraine, all of these elements, and then they start to expel huge numbers of refugees from. They get rid of all the Muslims, basically, kick them all out, and the rest of the Ottoman lands have to welcome them. All of this is extremely expensive, but the Ottomans never said enough, we can't handle anymore. They always welcomed refugees in. So that weakened them economically. The other thing that's often talked about, I'm not so sure that this is as important as people make out, but it might be, is the business about the printing press, that the Ottomans were slow to adopt the printing press. They didn't want the Quran to be printed. That was one of the arguments put forward. So it meant that Europe was able to forge ahead with producing books in a much faster way, so educating their public faster, if you like. So this led to a little bit of stagnation round about then. Good. So it's all, empires rise and fall, and nobody can stay in power forever. But the Ottomans did, without the Russian interference, I wonder actually how much longer they would have lasted.
Understood. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time.
Very brief question. I just add one thing more about the Ottoman financial systems, because...
No comments. Question.
The question is how they contributed for the very strong economy. Even we have learned current Europe is something getting best of the financial practices from the Ottoman Empire. How you comment that? Yeah. Is it?
Well, we haven't, they have. Okay? Please, the benefit to the European economies, or have they modeled themselves on what were the Ottoman method of managing their economy? No?
I honestly don't know, is the answer to that. I mean, my understanding, they kept incredibly strong archives, the Ottomans. I mean, Ottoman archives are still being looked at. I mean, there are so many more to be researched and discovered, because everything was recorded mainly for tax reasons. This everybody was documented purely from a point of view of tax, and the contribution that they were able to make to the state.
And also you mentioned the kulia, for example, the open market system that they had, which allowed them to, goods produced anywhere could be transported and sold anywhere in the empire.
Yes, yes, and they obviously did inherit some of the things that the Arabs had invented, like the check, you know, the system of IOU, if you like, that you could just sign a document and no cash had to pass. But they inherited that from the Arabs before.
Good. Moni, please.
Yes, please. So the word Ottoman, where does it come from? Is it derived from Osman?
Yes, yes, Osmanli. So that means of Osman, you know, so it's his dynasty from him, yes. So it's just, we corrupted it to become Ottoman, that's all.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just conclude very briefly? Lessons that you've included in your book, there were three, which you summarized. Readiness to foster tolerance across the Ottoman Empire. So the first message that all of us could benefit from is tolerance. The second was openness towards refugees, and we've got enough of them, you know, resident in the north. And the last was religious and ethnic coexistence. And these are all three important messages that are still valid for all communities today. We in Pakistan are closer to Turkey than we think. And I'm going to end with an analogy that Turkey has had 4 military coups since 1960. They have moved into a different trajectory at the moment. But Mehmet Dulger, who's a Turkish parliamentarian and a member of the True Path Party, what new parties keep being produced in democratic systems, he wrote once, "The military consider themselves the real owners of this country." He means Turkey. "Because they were ready to give their lives to save us. But I would like to be governed, not saved. I want to be saved from the people who want to save me." So, may we end on that, and may I ask you to give an ovation to Diana. Thank you very much indeed, Diana.